Hello everybody, I'm back with another video for you today. My audience on Twitch has been asking me a lot to make a video on when is good to snap and when it's good to retreat in Marvel Snap. So I'm going to be making a video now on these very important decisions that can make or break your climb in Marvel Snap and that can help you gain a huge amount of ranks if you just do them correctly. So let's jump in, shall we? So there's a few things you need to consider when you're working out whether it's a good idea to snap to double the stakes of the game. The first thing that you should consider is your deck in general. How strong is it in comparison to the meta decks surrounding you? How strong is it in the context of the different pools of cards, and whether or not your deck is complete, or if there are cards that you could add to it to make it stronger compared to the opponent's decks. So I'll give you an example. At the moment, I am stuck playing only pool 2 cards because my game is bugged, but I am playing against people with pool 3, 4, and 5 cards. So inherently, I have had access to less cards. I've been able to only build this deck from pool 2 cards, so it's not going to be as strong as some of the other options that are out there for the opponents. So as such, my deck is inherently at a disadvantage compared to that stuff. You know, another example of this is, are you playing one of the best meta decks, Silver Surfer, at the moment, at the time of recording this? Are you playing a Silver Surfer deck? Or do you have something a bit more memey or a bit less just strong in general? That's the first thing you need to think about. So this leads me to the first principle when it comes to snapping, which is when you're playing from a place of weakness, whether that weakness is your deck, the cards in your hand and on the board, or the locations that you see and how they interact with your deck, that all of that would mean you should be snapping later on in the game, if at all. And the reverse is also true. If you're playing the strongest meta deck and the locations are good for you and your hand is perfect, then this will be a situation that warrants a very early snap to increase your rank gain from winning. So if your deck is weak, then think about snapping later on in the game so you can sort of see what's going on and just judge a bit better whether you're actually winning the game. And if your deck is very strong and you know it's very strong for the level that you're at, then you should consider doing early snaps to give your opponent less wiggle room to retreat at a good moment. With this first principle in mind of it's best to snap when you're in a place of strength, quite often the best snaps come when you are transitioning from a place of weakness to a place of strength. In other words, when it seems to your opponent that they're in the lead in the game, but you believe that you'll soon overtake them. That's the perfect moment to snap, as the opponent will not have an easy decision regarding retreating. To them, it will seem like they're winning already, so why would they not continue playing? This might look like a situation where you have a Scarlet Witch or a Storm, and you're about to change a location that maybe the opponent is relying on, something like that. Or it might be where you have a tech card that will drastically, damage or counter what the opponent is doing. So for example, a Killmonger, and the opponent has lots of one-cost cards, or maybe you have a Shang-Chi and they have a really big unit that they're not expecting will be destroyed by your Shang-Chi. These are like the prime time to be snapping, like the turn before you play those cards, because you're going to catch your opponent off guard and they're going to end up giving you a lot of extra cubes. At a high rank and a high level, these kind of snaps can also sometimes be used as a bluff. You know, you can say to your opponent, yes, I seem to be losing very heavily, but if I had this card, maybe I have a Killmonger, or maybe I have a Shang-Chi, and it's all going to be trouble for you if I play that. So don't really consider doing bluffs at low ranks, but once you get into the top ranks, that can be something that occasionally comes into play. The next principle I have for you is about the difference between early snapping before turn 3 or late game snapping, maybe turn 6 or a couple of turns before. So there are pros and cons to both approaches. Early snapping gives the opponent less information later on in the game about how strong your potential hand is or how strong your incoming plays are going to be, while still giving you the opportunity to gain extra cubes. Basically, if you snap late game, you're basically telling the opponent you feel very strong, and that's something that can be a negative. The opponent might feel scared and they might then retreat. Whereas if you've snapped early game, you're not giving them that same information. On the other hand, using your snap early game causes you to lose the ability to adapt to negative situations. Maybe there's a bad location coming up that you didn't foresee, or maybe the opponent has a particularly nasty tech card that really hurts you, or just a very powerful play, or you didn't realize what deck they were playing, and now you suddenly do, and you can't retreat without losing the extra cube. So that's the downside of early snapping. There's a pro to it and a con. So again, consider how strong your deck is in relation to the other decks, and how strong your hand is and the locations and all of that stuff, when taking into account whether you should do an early snap or wait and maybe do one in the late game. Generally speaking, I would say it's a good idea to hold on to your snap until you've seen at least all of the locations. This way you can sort of plan around what the game state is looking like. You can also see a couple of cards from the opponent and potentially get an idea of what deck they might be playing, whether your deck is any good into it or whether they counter you, and that kind of thing. With the exception of maybe you want to snap if you see a particularly great location for your deck. For example, you might see that the Raft is one of the early locations, and you have a lot of 1-drops in your hand, 1-cost cards. Maybe you want to snap on that because that location is particularly great for you. But yeah, I would say generally speaking, waiting until after you've seen all the locations is a pretty good way to go. Another snap principle is that generally speaking, snapping on turn 6 when you're already very far ahead of the opponent is not the best idea. And this is just because the opponent will have more information than you do as to their chances of winning the game, right? And if they're playing from behind especially, so maybe you haven't seen as many cards played by the opponent compared to how many cards you've played, and so they will have a better idea of what your deck is, what you're doing, and all of that stuff. So basically, if you snap in that situation, there's two outcomes, right? The first is that the opponent just retreats because they were already in a very bad position, and the second outcome is that they don't retreat because they have some way to swing the game back in their favor. And that thing you've probably not already foreseen it if you're already very far ahead. So I would just caution against snapping when you're super far ahead. When the game already looks won, probably don't need to snap, because the best case scenario, yeah. I mean, sometimes it can still be worth doing it. People will then make the mistake of not retreating. So maybe this applies a bit more to higher ranked play, but it's just something to keep in mind from a game theory perspective. Finally, and perhaps the most important point when it comes to snapping, is snapping is ill-advised when you're unsure what the opponent's next plays will look like and when the game is close. And snapping is advised when you can easily narrow down what the opponent will likely do next, and when you've worked out that you're going to be winning in the event that they do play that play that you're thinking of. So with this in mind, the ability to work out what the opponent's likely deck and cards are is important when deciding whether or not you want to snap. So meta knowledge is very important when it comes to ranking up and using that snap mechanic to gain extra cubes to make the ranking up easier. Retreating is as much of a skill as knowing when to snap, but it basically works the reverse way of knowing when to snap. So if there's a situation where it's bad for you to snap, then it's likely true that it's a good time for you to retreat if the opponent snaps. There are exceptions to this. So for example, if your opponent snaps very early in the game for seemingly little reason, then you might want to continue playing rather than retreat. Or if you've narrowed down what your opponent has and know you're able to beat it with a surprising or powerful play, then it might be better to stay in the game or even snap back on the opponent. If this isn't the case, you should just consider that the opponent in lower ranks especially is basically going to say that they think they're winning the game when they snap you. And with that in mind, try to work out if what they're saying is true, and if there's a decent chance that it is, you should probably just retreat. One of the ways to retreat optimally is to work out the reason why the opponent snapped you. Was it because they have a strong play coming up? Maybe because of the location being revealed and it being good for their deck? Or did they just draw all the cards they need to execute their deck's game plan? If you can isolate what's going on in the mind of the opponent, then you can work out whether their snap is something you should be worried about and therefore retreat, or if they're just an inexperienced player, if they're bad at snapping, or if they're about to be wrecked by your upcoming plays. Generally speaking, you should be retreating a lot of the time on turn 6. This is a common mistake that lower ranked players make. If you're not in a decisively winning position, or if you have a very telegraphed finisher, a very predictable finisher, and the game seems close, then retreating is always an option to minimize potential losses. So many lower ranked players will lose games because they won't retreat on turn 6, despite it being fairly obvious that they aren't winning the game or that their turn 6 play won't really change anything. If you can learn to retreat while those around you are simply gambling on turn 6 and saying, I want to see what card they have, or they're feeling frustrated and they just, I don't want to retreat, I want to at least have a chance of winning. If you can avoid those mistakes, then you're going to climb the ranks a lot faster. It's also important to keep in mind how many times people have snapped when factoring in whether retreating is a good option. If you've already snapped and the opponent snaps on turn 6, then the cube gain or loss will essentially be quadrupling from 2 to 8. As such, you would essentially be paying 8 cubes to see the final play of the game, and you'd be paying 2 cubes to retreat. When thinking of retreating in these terms, it becomes easier to see whether your play is making sense or whether you should retreat. So let's say the opponent can play in only 2 rows, and you have a 50% chance to take the game. Pretty common situation in Marvel Snap. There's just a straight 50-50. If I play my card here, I very likely win. If I play my card there, I also very likely win, but it's a 50-50. So this would result in a cube EV, or estimated value, of 0 cubes, right? Because there's 8 cubes, half of the time you get 8, half of the time you lose 8. So on average, you're getting 0 cubes. Compare that to when you retreat, in that example, you actually would lose 2 cubes. So it's always better if it's a straight 50-50 and it's going from 2 to 8 cubes, it's always better to just take the chance and see what happens. And the same goes for 4 and 8 cubes. And yeah, generally speaking, those high cube numbers, or any 50-50, you should just be taking the 50-50 instead of retreating. So whenever there's a less than 50% chance of you winning the final turn, it might be best to retreat. It probably is. So if you're hoping for the opponent to not draw a specific card from their deck, for example, you need to face reality and understand that the chance of them drawing a card from their deck is around 75%. If you calculate cube EV after that, after a double snap, then the outcome here would be -4 cubes for you, compared to -2 cubes for retreating. So that's an easy retreat decision. If you're thinking of a card that you know their deck plays, and they could draw it and win the game with it, then you should always retreat in that spot. It's always better to retreat. So you can use a little bit of mathematics and a little bit of thinking about it in terms of how many cubes are you paying versus how many cubes are you paying to retreat, how many cubes are you paying to see the last play, how many paying to retreat. If you look at it in those terms, then you should be able to work out whether it's worth it to play on or cut your losses and go play the next game. So those are some of my principles and general tips for snapping and retreating. I see people making a lot of mistakes when it comes to these mechanics. They're quite difficult to get, and they're very similar to some concepts that already exist in games like poker. But yeah, I hope that I could help you a little bit with that information. Let me know what you thought of the video down below. Do subscribe, of course, for more content. Comment some video ideas that you'd like to see. I have some more things in the works that I'd like to make, but do give me some suggestions. I might even make some of those into a reality. With that being said, that's all I've got for you guys today. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.